What's up guys, Small Somerville here, and I had to give my thoughts on the new M2 MacBook Air because I think this base model is a bit of a doozy, and mostly because of what they're charging for this thing. I kind of want my M1 Air back, but if you're a fan of good ideas, consider subscribing to the channel for future content like this. Let's dig into why. So the new design for the MacBook is one of the ways Apple's trying to justify this price hike, and if you've been following the rumor mill like me, then you'd know that this redesign was coming and that this was part of Apple's master plan for a new universal design language for the MacBooks. And at first, I thought it was fine. It didn't really bother me at all when seeing it at renders, but I gotta admit, after getting it in my hands, I really do miss the tapered design, not really from an aesthetic standpoint, but just when it comes to like handling the machine. I think there was something about that tapered design that makes it slightly more comfortable to use in my bed or in my lap and stuff like that. That could just be me, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And this is obviously a light computer. It's technically lighter than the last one, but it doesn't feel any lighter than the M1 Air or prior models, and that's definitely not a complaint, just an observation. And in terms of the colors, I didn't get the midnight option. I got Starlight just to be different mostly, but I don't regret it because it not only looks like midnight is extremely fingerprint prone, but it's also extremely noticeable when you scrape the edge around the Thunderbolt ports, which everyone is bound to do at some point. So I'd avoid midnight unless you just gotta have that color and don't care. And I'd honestly understand wanting midnight because silver and space gray are kind of played out, and this Starlight one is honestly just kind of boring. But if I were to sum up the M2 Air's design as a whole, I'd say it feels a lot more like a MacBook Lite than a MacBook Air for me. I don't know if that makes any sense. The display itself on the MacBook Air has gotten a little over a ½ inch bigger than the M1 MacBook Air, and you can definitely feel the difference, but it's still a very portable feeling laptop. But I personally would have been just as satisfied using the machine if the size remained the same. And it makes me wonder why Apple decided to make the laptop bigger. Are people genuinely over the 13-inch size, or was Apple just seeking room for a bigger battery? But there are a few changes to the display, the first of which being a bump in the max brightness to 500 nits. So watching HDR content on the M2 Air is slightly more enjoyable than on the M1 Air. The display also now gets dimmer than before with the new minimum brightness, and because of the increase in size, the PPI has actually gone down to 224 from 227 on the M1 Air, and obviously that's indistinguishable to the human eye, but I thought I'd point it out. The speakers is also a weird one for me, and not because they sound bad, obviously they sound good in a MacBook, but just because the sound delivery is now different in a way that I don't necessarily prefer. And I feel like they could have retained the design where the speakers flank both sides of the keyboard like on previous versions. The speaker grills are now kind of hidden and firing through these tiny little speaker grills on the inner side of the hinge. And even though these are technically new speakers with dual woofers, I feel like because of the placement, the speakers somewhat lack that stereo feel now compared to the M1 Air. But none of this is to say the speakers are bad, because they're definitely really good compared to other $1,200 laptops. But I wish they could have kept the setup the same, honestly. Now, the MacBook Air finally has a MagSafe port back in the fold after a few years of only having Thunderbolt ports, and I honestly appreciate it being back, mostly for freeing up the secondary Thunderbolt port for additional data connections. Another thing I honestly appreciate is the addition of high-impedance headphone support for the headphone jack, so you can now use studio-oriented high-impedance headphones without the need for an amplifier. It's honestly not something I expected Apple to do for their non-pro laptop. The webcam has finally also been bumped to a 1080p sensor, basically the same one that you'll find in the MacBook Pro and iMac, and it's whatever. It's obviously a notable improvement over the M1 Air's camera, but I think as soon as Ventura releases this fall, I'll be sticking to using continuity camera because it's just so much better than what they've gotten here currently. But there is no M2 Air review without addressing the biggest problem of this base model machine, which is the fact that Apple decided to use a singular SSD module for the base as opposed to two SSD modules, which they did on the previous M1 Air and M1 MacBook Pro, and that results in a literal 50% drop in SSD read and write speed. So if you open up a speed test application like Blackmagic, the numbers don't lie, and so not only is the performance for copying and writing large files going to be worse than M1, but there's also the issue of memory swapping, and this is basically when the M1 or M2 chips dip into the SSD to use additional virtual memory. And so when the write speed capability of the SSD goes down, the memory swap performance goes down as well, and that's definitely something I felt when using this base MacBook Air. So far, there hasn't been a reasonable justification from Apple for doing this from a technical or functional perspective, And so it makes me feel like they were just trying to cut costs, and that feels pretty grimy when this machine already costs $200 more than the M1 version. And so I think the solution here is simple. Firstly, do not buy this base model M2 Air or the base model M2 MacBook Pro. Every model above the 256 will have the dual NAND SSDs, so you won't experience this issue. And secondly, I think Apple has taken a major L here for this move, and I think it's one that they should hopefully never make again. This is literally the first Mac I've ever used that makes me want to go back to the old one, and this is one of the reasons why, but let's dig into the actual performance. When it comes to performance, I think there's a fine line to be walked because this base M2 Air isn't being marketed as a performance-oriented machine, and if you want a performance-oriented Mac, you're better off with a 16 gig M2 MacBook Pro or a 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro. But Apple claims that the M2 is up to 1.4 times faster than M1, and yes, in most cases that is true when comparing this base M2 model to a base M1 Air, but I thought it'd be more interesting to compare this 8GB M2 Air to a 16GB M1 Air, which can be bought still brand new from Apple for the exact same price as this machine. And in pretty much every time performance test I ran, the M1 Air outperformed the M2 Air. Depending on the task, the differences were pretty marginal, but I will say that the M2 Air was always noticeably slower when trying to do other tasks while doing something like exporting a video or a large batch of photos. While exporting a video on M2, web pages would be noticeably slower when it comes to rendering, and YouTube videos would stutter and drop frames. And as far as the video tests themselves, I didn't go too crazy because this is an Air, so no 8K video or 45-minute timelines or anything like that. I tried a few 8-minute 4K videos and even tried a few 45-second 4K videos comprised of a bunch of high-quality clips, and in every test I ran, the M1 Air with 16 gigs of RAM gave me less hassle, even with the technically weaker graphics card. Do I think the SSD issue has anything to do with performance results I'm getting? Yes, absolutely, but I also feel like M2 is more of like an M1S in terms of the overall performance, and I think the fact that Apple called this M2 as opposed to M1S or something less significant maybe put bigger expectations in my head and other people's heads for performance than I should have had. And now don't get me wrong, all this isn't to say that M2 is objectively bad in terms of performance, because it's not. It's still a super capable platform for how little power it is required to run it, but it's definitely been a disappointing experience using this and feeling like the M1 Air is better, you know? That shouldn't be how I feel when using a newer machine. Now, one of the biggest pros for going for an M2 Air or any MacBook Air is the battery life. My experience with the battery life on the M2 Air has been phenomenal, just like the M1 has been for me. When spending the majority of the day using the Air for web browsing and watching web content, you can easily get a full day's worth of on and off usage. But when doing performance-oriented tasks on battery power for like an hour or so, you'll definitely notice a serious dip in battery capacity. It's definitely not something you can do all day. It's also something you wouldn't want to do all day in my experience, because I've also noticed a pretty substantial boost in smoothness when doing intensive tasks with the battery charging as opposed to it not. But like I said, for web browsing, using Word or Excel, watching YouTube videos, Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever, the M2 Air will last you all day. Overall, I don't think the M2 Air is a bad product, at least this base model, but I definitely think it's a failure at properly succeeding the M1 Air, at least the base model M1 Air. As far as the new stuff you're getting with this, the design, MagSafe, a better camera, new speakers, slightly brighter display, and a larger battery, these things are all nice updates, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think those changes make this an overall better value than the base M1 MacBook Air when you consider the performance downsides. And if you were to give me $1,200 to spend at Apple on a MacBook, at this point I'd be more inclined to get the M1 Air with 16 gigs of memory, and that's basically because of the performance combined with all these features for M2 feeling unnecessary. I don't feel like I need any of this. The 1080p camera, it's nice, but I don't feel like I need it. MagSafe, it's nice, but I don't feel like I need it. The new 4-speaker system, it's nice, but I don't feel like I need it. And I think Apple knew this when they dropped the M2 Air, because they're still selling the M1 Air on the website. You can still buy it brand new and in multiple memory and storage configurations. And so for the same money, I think that 16 gig of memory M1 MacBook Air with 256 gigs of storage is the better option than what's sitting right here in front of me, unfortunately. And I guess that's the reason why I want my M1 Air back, because I started using the M2 Air. But let us know in the comments below what your thoughts are on this Base M2 MacBook Air, and if there are any other specific comparisons or content you want to see around it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.